of responsibility to its stockholders, seeing no reason why it should report more than what may seem expedient at the moment. In any event, the investor will do well to exclude from investment any company that withholds or tries to hide bad news. Point 15. Does the company have a management of unquestionable integrity? The management of a company is always far closer to its assets than is the stockholder. Without breaking any laws, the number of ways in which those in control can benefit themselves and their families at the expense of the ordinary stockholder is almost infinite. One way is to put themselves, to say nothing of their relatives or in-laws, on the payroll at salaries far above the normal worth of the work performed. Another is to own properties they sell or rent to the corporation at above market rates. Among smaller corporations this is sometimes hard to detect, since controlling families or key officers at times buy and lease real estate to such companies, not for purposes of unfair gain but in a sincere desire to free limited working capital for other corporate purposes. Another method for insiders to enrich themselves is to get the corporation's vendors to sell through certain brokerage firms which perform little if any service for the brokerage commissions involved but which are owned by these same insiders and relatives or friends. Probably most costly of all to the investor is the abuse by insiders of their power of issuing common stock options. They can pervert this legitimate method of compensating able management by issuing to themselves amounts of stock far beyond what an unbiased outsider might judge to represent a fair reward for services performed. There is only one real protection against abuses like these. This is to confine investments to companies the managements of which have a highly developed sense of trusteeship and moral responsibility to their stockholders. This is a point concerning which the scuttlebutt method can be very helpful. Any investment may still be considered interesting if it falls down in regard to almost any other one of the 15 points which have now been covered, but rates an unusually high score in regard to all the rest. Regardless of how high the rating may be in all other matters, however, if there is a serious question of the lack of a strong management sense of trusteeship for stockholders, the investor should never seriously consider participating in such an enterprise. What to buy? Applying this to your own needs. The average investor is not a specialist in the field of investment. If a man, he usually gives but a tiny fraction of the time or mental effort to handling his investments that he devotes to his own work. If a woman, the time and effort given to investments is equally small compared to that devoted to her normal duties. The result is that the typical investor has usually gathered a good deal of the half-truths, misconceptions, and just plain bunk that the general public has gradually accumulated about successful investing. One of the most widespread and least accurate of such ideas is the popular conception of what traits are needed to be an investment wizard. If a public opinion poll were taken on the subject, I suspect John Q. Public's composite picture of such an expert would be an introverted, bookish individual with an accounting-type mind. This scholastic-like investment expert would sit all day in undisturbed isolation poring over vast quantities of balance sheets, corporate earnings statements, and trade statistics. From these, his superior intellect and deep understanding of figures would glean information not available to the ordinary mortal. This type of cloistered study would yield invaluable knowledge about the location of magnificent investments. Like so many other widespread misconceptions, this mental picture has just enough accuracy to make it highly dangerous for anyone wanting to get the greatest long-range benefit from common stocks. As already pointed out in the discussion of the 15 points to be considered if a major investment winner is to be selected by any means other than pure luck, a few of these matters are largely determined by cloistered mathematical calculation. Furthermore, As mentioned near the beginning of this book, there is more than one method by which an investor, if sufficiently skilled, can over the years make some money, occasionally even really worthwhile money, through investment. The purpose of this book is not to point out every way such money can be made. Rather, it is to point out the best way. By the best way is meant the greatest total profit for the least risk. The type of accounting statistical activity which the general public seems to visualize as the heart of successful investing will, if enough effort be given it, turn up some apparent bargains. Some of these may be real bargains. In the case of others, there may be such acute business troubles lying ahead, yet not discernible from a purely statistical study, that instead of being bargains they are actually selling at prices which in a few years will have proven to be very high. Meanwhile, in the case of even the genuine bargain, the degree by which it is undervalued is usually somewhat limited. The time it takes to get adjusted to its true value is frequently considerable. So far as I have been able to observe, this means that over a time sufficient to give a fair comparison, say 5 years, the most skilled statistical bargain hunter ends up with a profit which is but a small part of the profit attained by those using reasonable intelligence in appraising the business characteristics of superbly managed growth companies. This, of course, is after charging the growth stock investor with losses on ventures which did not turn out as expected, and charging the bargain hunter for a proportionate amount of bargains that just didn't turn out. The reason why the growth stocks do so much better is that they seem to show gains in value in the hundreds of % each decade. In contrast, it is an unusual bargain that is as much as 50% undervalued. The cumulative effect of the simple arithmetic should be obvious. At this point, the potential investor may have to start revising his ideas about the amount of time needed to locate the right investments for his purpose, to say nothing of the characteristics he must have if he is to find them. Perhaps he looked forward to spending a few hours each week in the comfort of his home, studying scads of written material which he felt would unlock the door to worthwhile profits. He just does not have the time to seek out, cultivate, and talk with all the various people it might be wise to contact if he wants to handle his common stock investments to his optimum benefit. Perhaps he does have the time. He still may not have the inclination and personality to seek out and chat with a group of people, most of whom he previously had not known very well if at all. Furthermore, it is not enough just to chat with them. It is necessary to arouse their interest and their confidence to a point where they will tell what they know. The successful investor is usually an individual who is inherently interested in business problems. This results in his discussing such matters in a way that will arouse the interest of those from whom he is seeking data. Naturally, he must have reasonably good judgment or all the data he gets will avail him nothing. An investor may have the time, inclination, and judgment but still be blocked from getting maximum results in the handling of his common stocks. The matter of geography is also a factor. An investor, for example, living in or near Detroit would have opportunities for learning about automotive accessory and parts companies that would not be available to one equally diligent or able in Oregon. But so many major companies and industries are today organized on a nationwide basis with distribution, if not manufacturing, centers in most key cities, that investors living in larger industrial centers or their suburbs usually have ample opportunities to practice the art of finding at least a few outstanding long-range investments. This unfortunately is not equally true for those living in rural areas remote from such centers. However, the rural investor or the overwhelming majority of other investors who may not have the time, inclination, or ability to uncover outstanding investments for themselves are by no means barred from making such investments because of this. Actually, the investor's work is so specialized and so intricate that there is no more reason why an individual should handle his own investments than that he should be his own lawyer, doctor, architect, or automobile mechanic. He should perform these functions if he has special interest in and skill at the particular field. Otherwise, he definitely should go to an expert. What is important is that he know enough of the principles involved so that he can pick a real expert rather than a hack or a charlatan. In some ways, it is easier for a careful layman to pick an outstanding investment advisor than, say, a comparably superior doctor or lawyer. In other ways, it is much harder. It is harder because the investment field has developed much more recently than most comparable specialties. As a result, mass ideas have not yet crystallized to the point where there is an accepted line of demarcation between true knowledge and mumbo-jumbo. There are not as yet the barriers to weed out the ignorant and the incompetent in the financial field that exist, for example, in the fields of law or medicine. Even among some of the so-called authorities on investment, there is still enough lack of agreement on the basic principles involved that it is as yet impossible to have schools for training investment experts comparable to the recognized schools for teaching law or medicine. This makes even more remote the practicability of government authorities licensing those having the necessary background of knowledge to guide others in investments in a manner comparable to the way our states license the practicing of law or medicine. It is true that many of our states do go through the form of licensing investment advisors. However, in such instances only known dishonesty or financial insolvency, rather than a lack of training or skill, provides the basis for denying a license. All this probably results in a higher percentage of incompetence among financial advisors than may exist in fields such as law and medicine. However, there are compensating factors that can enable an individual with no personal expertness in investments to pick a capable financial advisor more easily than a comparably outstanding doctor or lawyer. Finding out which physician had lost the smallest percentage of his practice through deaths would not be a good way to pick a superb doctor. Neither would a corresponding box score of cases won and lost show the relative skill of attorneys. Fortunately, most medical treatments are not matters of immediate life or death, and a good lawyer will frequently avoid going into litigation at all. In the investment advisor's case it is quite different, however. There is a scoreboard that, after enough time has elapsed, should pretty much reflect that advisor's investment skill. In occasional cases it may take as much as 5 years for investments to demonstrate their real merit. Usually it does not take that long. It would normally be foolhardy for anyone to entrust his savings to the skill of a so-called advisor who, working either for himself or others, had less than 5 years' experience. Therefore, in the case of investments, there is no reason why those trying to pick a professional advisor should not demand to see a fair cross-section of results obtained for others. Those results, compared to a record of security prices for the same period of time, give a real clue to the advisor's ability. 2 more steps are then necessary before an investor should make final determination of the individual or organization to which he will delegate the important responsibility for his funds. One is the obvious step of being certain of that advisor's complete and unquestioned honesty. The other step is more complex. A financial advisor may have obtained far above average results during a period of falling prices not because of skill but because he always keeps a large part of the funds he manages in, let us say, high-grade bonds. At another time, after a long period of rising prices, Another advisor may have obtained above-average results because of a tendency to go into risky, marginal companies. As explained in the discussion of profit margins, such companies usually do well only in such a period and subsequently do rather poorly. Still, a third advisor might do well in both such periods because of a tendency to try to guess what the security markets are going to do. This can produce magnificent results for a while, but is almost impossible to continue indefinitely. Before selecting an advisor, an investor should learn from that advisor the nature of his basic concept of financial management. He should then only accept an advisor with concepts fundamentally the same as the investor's own. Naturally, I believe that the concepts expressed in this book are those which fundamentally should govern. Many, reared in the old-time financial atmosphere of buy them when they are cheap and sell them when they are high, would strongly disagree with this conclusion. Assuming an investor desires the type of huge, long-range gain which I believe should be the objective of nearly all common stock purchases, there is one matter which he must decide for himself, whether he uses an investment advisor or handles his own affairs. It is a decision which must be made because the type of stocks which qualify most satisfactorily under the previously discussed 15 points can vary considerably among themselves in their investment characteristics. At one end of the scale are large companies which, in spite of outstanding prospects of major further growth, are so financially strong, with roots going so deep into the economic soil, that they qualify under the general classification of institutional stocks. This means that insurance companies, professional trustees, and similar institutional buyers will buy them. They will do so because they feel that, while they may misjudge market prices and could lose a part of their original investment should they be forced to sell such stocks at a time of lower quotations, they are avoiding the greater danger of loss they could suffer if they bought into a company that subsequently fell from its present competitive position. The Dow Chemical Company, DuPont, and International Business Machines are good examples of this type of growth stock. In Chapter 1 I mentioned the totally insignificant return available from high-grade bonds during the 10-year period 1946 to 1956. At the close of this period, each of these three stocks, Dow, DuPont, and IBM, had a value approximately 5 times what it sold for at the beginning of the period. Nor during these 10 years did their holders suffer from the standpoint of current income. Dow, for example, is almost notorious for the low rate of return it customarily pays on current market price. Yet the investor who bought Dow at the start of this period would at the end of it be doing well from the standpoint of current income. Although Dow at the time of purchase would only have provided a return of about 2.5%, this was a period when yields on all stocks were high. Just 10 years later it had increased dividends or split stock so many times that the investor would have been enjoying a dividend return of between 8 and 9% on the price of his investment 10 years earlier. More significantly, the 10-year period covered is not an unusual one for companies of the caliber of these three. Decade after decade, with only occasional interruptions from such one-time influences as the great 1929 to 1932 bear market or World War II, these stocks have given almost fabulous performance. At the other end of the scale, also of extreme interest for the right sort of long-range investment, are small and frequently young companies which may only have total sales of from $1 to $6 or $7 million per annum, but which also have products that might bring a sensational future. To qualify under the 15 points already described, such companies will usually have a combination of outstanding business management and equally capable scientific personnel who are pioneering in a new or economically promising field. The Ampex Corporation at the time the stock was first offered to the public in 1953 might serve as a good example of this type of company. Within 4 years the value of this stock had increased over sevenfold. Between these two extremes lie a host of other promising growth companies varying all the way from those as young and risky as was Ampex in 1953 to those as strong and well-entrenched as are Dow, DuPont, and IBM today. Assuming it is time to buy at all, see the next chapter. Which type should the investor buy? The young growth stock offers by far the greatest possibility of gain. Sometimes this can mount up to several thousand% in a decade. But making at least an occasional investment mistake is inevitable even for the most skilled investor. It should never be forgotten that if such a mistake is made in this type of common stock, every dollar put into the investment can be lost. In contrast, if the stock is bought according to the rules described in the next chapter, any losses that might occur in the older and more established growth stocks should be temporary, resulting from a period of unanticipated decline in the stock market as a whole. The long-range gain in value of this class of big company growth stock will, over the years, be considerably less than that of the small and usually younger enterprise. Nevertheless, it will mount to thoroughly worthwhile totals. Even in the most conservative of the growth stocks it should run to at least several times the original investment. Therefore, for anyone risking a stake big enough to be of real significance to himself or his family, the rule to follow should be rather obvious. It is to put most of his funds into the type of company which, while perhaps not as large as a Dow, a DuPont, or an International Business Machines, at least comes closer to that type of stock than to the small young company. Whether this most be 60% or 100% of total investments varies with the needs or requirements of each individual. A widow with $500,000 of total assets and no children might put all her funds in the more conservative class of growth stocks. Another widow with $1 million to invest and 3 children for whom she would like to increase her assets, to a degree that would not, however, jeopardize her scale of living, might well put up to 15% of her assets in carefully selected small young companies. A businessman with a wife, 2 children, a present investment worth $400,000, and an income big enough to save $10,000 per annum after taxes might put all his present $400,000 into the more conservative type growth companies but venture the $10,000 of new savings each year on the more risky half of the investment scale. In all these cases, however, the gain in value over the years of the more conservative group of stocks should be enough to outweigh even complete loss of all funds put into the more risky type. Meanwhile, if properly selected, the more risky type could significantly increase the total capital gain. Equally important, if this happens, these young risky companies will by that time have reached a point in their own development where their stocks will no longer be carrying anything like the former degree of risk but may even have progressed to a status where institutions have begun buying them. The problems of the small investor are somewhat more difficult. The large investor can often completely ignore the matter of dividend returns in his endeavor to employ all his funds in situations affording maximum growth potential. After his funds are so invested, he may still obtain from them sufficient dividends either to take care of his desired standard of living or to enable him to attain this standard if the dividend income is added to his other regular earning power. Most small investors cannot live on the return on their investment no matter how high a yield is obtained, since the total value of their holdings is not great enough. Therefore, for the small investor, the matter of current dividend return usually comes down to a choice between a few $100s a year starting right now, or the chance of obtaining an income many times as few $100s a year at a later date. Before reaching a decision on this crucial point, there is one matter which the small investor should face squarely. This is that the only funds he should consider using for common stock investment are funds that are truly surplus. This does not mean using all funds that remain over and above what he needs for everyday living expense. Except in the most unusual circumstances, he should have a backlog of several $1,000s, sufficient to take care of illnesses or other unexpected contingencies, before attempting to buy anything with as much intrinsic risk as a common stock. Similarly, funds already set aside for some specific future purpose, such as sending a child through college, should never be risked in the stock market. It is only after taking care of matters of this sort that he should consider common stock investment. The objective which the small investor then has for the surplus becomes somewhat a matter of personal choice and of his particular circumstances, including the size and nature of his other income. A young man or woman, or an older investor with children or other heirs of whom he or she is particularly fond, may be willing to sacrifice a dividend income of, say, $30 or $40 a month in order to obtain an income 10 times that size in 15 years. In contrast, an elderly person with no close heirs would naturally prefer a larger immediate income. Similarly, a person earning a relatively small income and with heavy financial obligations might have no choice but to provide for immediate needs. However, for the great majority of small investors, the decision on the importance of immediate income is one of personal choice. It probably is largely dependent on the psychology of each individual investor. My own purely personal view is that a small amount of additional income, after taxes, pales in comparison to an investment that in the years ahead could bring me a sizable income and, in time, might make my children really wealthy. Others may feel quite differently about this. It is to the large investor, and to the small investor who feels as I do on this subject and desires an intelligent approach to the principles that have made these kinds of results possible, that the procedures set forth in this book are presented. The success which any particular individual will have in applying these principles to his own investments will depend on two things. One is the degree of skill with which he applies them. The other is, of course, the matter of good fortune. In an age when an unforeseeable discovery might happen tomorrow in a research laboratory in no way connected with the company in which the investment has been made, and in an age when 5 years from now that unrelated research development could result in either tripling or cutting in half the profits of this investment, good fortune obviously can play a tremendous part so far as any one investment is concerned. This is why even the medium-sized investor has an advantage over those of very small means. This element of good or bad fortune will largely average out if several well-selected investments are chosen. However, for both large and small investors who prefer far greater income some years from now to maximum possible return today, it is well to remember that during the past 35 years numerous studies have been made by various financial authorities. These have compared the results obtained from the purchase of common stocks which afford a high dividend yield with those obtained from the purchase of low-yield stocks of companies that have concentrated on growth and the reinvestment of assets. As far as I know, every one of these studies has shown the same trend. The growth stocks, over a 5 or 10-year span, have proven spectacularly better so far as their increase in capital value is concerned. More surprising, in the same time span such stocks have usually so increased their dividends that, while still paying a low return in relation to the enhanced value at which they were by then selling, they were by this time paying a greater dividend return on the original investment than were the stocks selected for yield alone. In other words, The growth stocks had not only shown a marked superiority in the field of capital appreciation, but given a reasonable time, they had grown to a point where they showed superiority in the matter of dividend return as well. When to buy? The preceding chapters attempted to show that the heart of successful investing is knowing how to find the minority of stocks that in the years ahead will have spectacular growth in their per-share earnings. Therefore, is there any reason to divert time or mental effort from the main issue? Does not the matter of when to buy become of relatively minor importance? Once the investor is sure he has definitely found an outstanding stock, isn't any time at all a good time to buy it? The answer to this depends somewhat on the investor's objective. It also depends on his temperament. Let us take an example. With the ease of hindsight, it can be made the most extreme example in modern financial history. This would be the purchase of several superbly selected enterprises in the summer of 1929, or just before the greatest stock market crash of American history. In time, such a purchase would have turned out well. But 25 years later it would provide a much smaller percentage gain than would have been the case if, having done the hardest part of the job in selecting his companies properly, an investor had made the small extra effort needed to understand a few simple principles about the timing of growth stocks. In other words, if the right stocks are bought and held long enough, they will always produce some profit. Usually they will produce a handsome profit. However, to produce close to the maximum profit, the kind of spectacular profit defined earlier, some consideration must be given to timing. The conventional method of timing when to buy stocks is, I believe, just as silly as it appears on the surface to be sensible. This method is to marshal a vast mass of economic data. From these data, conclusions are reached as to the near and medium-term course of general business. More sophisticated investors will usually form opinions about the future course of money rates as well as business activity. Then, if their forecasts for all these matters indicate no major worsening of background conditions, the conclusion is that the desired stock may be bought. It sometimes appears that dark clouds are forming on the horizon. Then those who use this generally accepted method will postpone or cancel purchases they otherwise would make. My objection to this approach is not that it is unreasonable in theory. It is that in the current state of human knowledge about the economics which deal with forecasting future business trends, it is impossible to apply this method in practice. The chances of being right are not good enough to warrant such methods being used as a basis for risking the investment of savings. This may not always be the case. It might not even be the case 5 or 10 years from now. At present, able men are attempting to harness electronic computers to establish input-output series of sufficient intricacy that perhaps at some future date it may be possible to know with a fair degree of precision what the coming business trends will be. When, if ever, such developments occur, the art of common stock investment may have to be radically revised. Until they occur, however, I believe that the economics which deal with forecasting business trends may be considered to be about as far along as was the science of chemistry during the days of alchemy in the Middle Ages. In chemistry then, as in business forecasting now, basic principles were just beginning to emerge from a mysterious mass of mumbo-jumbo. However, chemistry had not reached a point where such principles could be safely used as a basis for choosing a course of action. Occasionally, as in 1929, the economy gets so out of line that speculative enthusiasm for the future runs to unprecedented proportions. Even in our present state of economic ignorance, it is possible to make a pretty accurate guess as to what will occur. However, I doubt if the years when it is safe to do this have averaged much more than 1 out of 10. They may be even rarer in the future. The typical investor is so used to having economic forecasts made for him that he may start by trusting too strongly the dependability of such forecasts. If so, I suggest that he look over a file of the back issues of the Commercial and Financial Chronicle for any year he may choose since the end of World War II. As a matter of fact, it might pay him to look over such a file even though he is aware of the fallibility of these forecasts. Regardless of the year he selects, he will find, among other material, a sizable number of articles in which leading economic and financial authorities give their views of the outlook for the period ahead. Since the editors of this journal appear to select their material so as to give the ablest available presentations of both optimistic and pessimistic opinions, it is not surprising that opposing forecasts will be found in any such series of back issues. What is surprising is the degree by which such experts disagree with each other. Even more surprising is how strong and convincing some of the arguments were bound to seem at the time they were written. This is particularly true of some of the forecasts that turned out to be most wrong. The amount of mental effort the financial community puts into this constant attempt to guess the economic future from a random and probably incomplete series of facts makes one wonder what might have been accomplished if only a fraction of such mental effort had been applied to something with a better chance of proving useful. I have already compared economic forecasting with chemistry in the days of alchemy. Perhaps this preoccupation with trying to do something which apparently cannot yet be done properly permits another comparison with the Middle Ages. That was a period when most of the Western world lived in an environment of unnecessary want and human suffering. This was largely because the considerable mental ability of the period was devoted to fruitless results. Consider what might have been accomplished if half as much thought had been given to fighting hunger, disease, and greed as was devoted to debating such points as the number of angels that could balance on the head of a pin. Perhaps just part of the collective intelligence nowadays employed in the investment community's attempt to guess the future trend of the business cycle could produce spectacular results if it were harnessed to more productive purposes. If, then, conventional studies of the near-term economic prospect do not provide the right method of approach to the proper timing of buying, what does provide it? The answer lies in the very nature of growth stocks themselves. At the risk of being repetitious, let us review for a moment some of the basic characteristics of outstandingly desirable investments, as discussed in the preceding chapter. These companies are usually working, in one way or another, on the very frontiers of scientific technology. They are developing various new products or processes from the laboratory through the pilot plant to the early stages of commercial production. All of this costs money in varying amounts. All of it is a drain on other profits of the business. Even in the early stage of commercial production, the extra sales expense involved in building sufficient volume for a new product to furnish the desired margin of profit is such that the out-of-pocket losses at this stage of development may be greater than they were during the pilot plan period. From the standpoint of the investor, there are two aspects of all this that have particular significance. One of these is the impossibility of depending on any sure timetable in the development cycle of a new product. The other is that even for the most brilliantly managed enterprises, a percentage of failures is part of the cost of doing business. In a sport, such as baseball, even the most outstanding league champions will have dropped some percentage of their scheduled games. The point in the development of a new process that is perhaps worth the closest scrutiny from the standpoint of timing the buying of common stocks is that at which the first full-scale commercial plant is about to begin production. In a new plant for even established processes or products, there will probably be a shakedown period of 6 to 8 weeks that will prove rather expensive. It takes this long to get the equipment adjusted to the required operating efficiency and to weed out the inevitable bugs that seem to occur in breaking in modern intricate machinery. When the process is really revolutionary, this expensive shakedown period may extend far beyond the estimate of even the most pessimistic company engineer. Furthermore, when problems finally do get solved, the wary stockholders still cannot look forward to immediate profits. There are more months of still further drain while even more of the company's profits from older lines are being plowed back into special sales and advertising efforts to get the new product accepted. It may be that the company making all this effort is having such growth in revenue from other and older products that the drain on profits is not noticed by the average stockholder. Frequently, however, just the opposite happens. As word first gets out about a spectacular new product in the laboratory of a well-run company, eager buyers bid up the price of that company's shares. When word comes of successful pilot plant operation, the shares go still higher. Few think of the old analogy that operating a pilot plant is like driving an automobile over a winding country road at 10 miles per hour. Running a commercial plant is like driving on that same road at 100 miles per hour. Then when month after month difficulties crop up in getting the commercial plant started, these unexpected expenses cause per share earnings to dip noticeably. Word spreads that the plant is in trouble. Nobody can guarantee when, if ever, the problems will be solved. The former eager buyers of the stock become discouraged sellers. Down goes the price of the stock. The longer the shakedown lasts, the more market quotations sag. At last comes the good news that the plant is finally running smoothly. A 2-day rally occurs in the price of the stock. However, in the following quarter, when special sales expenses have caused a still further sag in net income, the stock falls to the lowest price in years. Word passes all through the financial community that the management has blundered. At this point, the stock might well prove a sensational buy. Once the extra sales effort has produced enough volume to make the first production scale plant pay, normal sales effort is frequently enough to continue the upward movement of the sales curve for many years. Since the same techniques are used, the placing in operation of a second, third, fourth, and fifth plant can nearly always be done without the delays and special expenses that occurred during the prolonged shakedown period of the first plant. By the time plant number 5 is running at capacity, the company has grown so big and prosperous that the whole cycle can be repeated on another brand new product without the same drain on earnings percentage-wise or the same downward effect on the price of the company's shares. The investor has acquired at the right time an investment which can grow for him for many years. In the original edition, I then used the following words to describe an example of this type of opportunity. I used an example that was still fairly recent at that time. I said, immediately prior to the 1954 congressional elections, certain investment funds took advantage of this type of situation. For several years before this time, American cyanamide shares had sold in the market at a considerably lower price-earnings ratio than most of the other major chemical companies. I believe this was because the general feeling in the financial community was that, while the Letterly division represented one of the world's most outstanding pharmaceutical organizations, the relatively larger industrial and agricultural chemical activities constituted a hodgepodge of expensive and inefficient plants flung together in the typical stock market merger period of the booming 1920s. These properties were generally considered anything but a desirable investment. Largely unnoticed was the fact that a new management was steadily but without fanfare cutting production costs, eliminating dead wood, and streamlining the organization. What was noticed was that this company was making a huge bet, making a major capital expenditure, for a company its size, in a giant new organic chemical plant at Fortier, Louisiana. So much complex engineering was designed into this plant that it should have surprised no one when the plant lagged many months behind schedule in reaching the break-even point. As the problems at Fortier continued, however, the situation added to the generally unfavorable light in which American cyanamide shares were then being regarded. At this stage, in the belief that buying point was at hand, the funds to which I have already referred acquired their holdings at an average price of 45.75. This would be 227.8 on the present shares as a result of a 2-for-L stock split which occurred in 1957. What has happened since? Sufficient time has elapsed for the company to begin getting the benefits of some of the management activities that were creating abnormal costs in 1954. Fortier is now profitable. Earnings have increased from $1.48 per present common share in 1954 to $2.10 per share in 1956 and promised to be slightly higher in 1957. A year in which most chemical, though not pharmaceutical, profits have run behind those of the year before. At least as important, Wall Street has come to realize that American cyanamide's industrial and agricultural chemical activities are worthy of institutional investment. As a result, the price-earnings ratio of these shares has changed noticeably. A 37% increase in earnings that has taken place in somewhat under 3 years has produced a gain in market value of approximately 85%. Since writing these words, the financial community's steady upgrading of the status of American cyanamide appears to have continued. With earnings for 1959 promising to top the previous all-time peak of $2.42 in 1957. The market price of these shares has steadily advanced. It now is about 60, representing a gain of about 70% in earning power and 163% in market value in the 5 years since the shares referred to in the first edition were acquired. I would like to end the discussion of American cyanamide on this happy note. However, in the preface to this revised edition I stated I intended to make this revision an honest record and not the most favorable sounding record it might appear plausible to present. You may have noticed that in the original edition I referred to this 1954 purchase of cyanamide stock by certain funds. These funds are no longer retaining the shares, which were sold in the spring of 1959 at an average price of about 49. This was of course significantly below the current market but still represented a profit of about 110%. The size of the profit had nothing whatsoever to do with the decision to sell. There were two motives behind this decision. One was that the long-range outlook for another company appeared even better. You will find this discussed in the next chapter as one of the valid reasons for selling. While not enough time has yet passed to give conclusive proof one way or the other, so far comparative market quotations for both stocks appear to have warranted this move. However, there was a second motive behind the switch of investments which hindsight may prove to be less creditable. This was concern that in relation to the most outstanding of competitive companies, American cyanamide's chemical, in contrast to its pharmaceutical, business was not making as much progress in broadening profit margins and establishing profitable new lines as had been hoped. Concern over these factors was accentuated by uncertainty over the possible costs of the company's attempt to establish itself in the acrylic fiber business in the highly competitive textile industry. This reasoning may prove to be correct and still could turn out to have been the wrong investment decision, because of bright prospects in the letterly, or pharmaceutical, division. These prospects have become more apparent since the shares were sold. The possibilities for a further sharp jump in laterally earning power in the medium-term future center around 1, a new and quite promising antibiotic, and 2, in time a sizable market for an oral live polio vaccine, a field in which this company has been a leader. These developments make it problematic and a matter that only the future will decide as to whether this decision to dispose of cyanamide shares may not have been an investment mistake. Because studying possible mistakes can be even more rewarding than reviewing past successes, I am going to suggest, even at the risk of appearing presumptuous, that anyone seriously interested in bettering his investment technique mark these last several paragraphs and reread them after having read the coming chapter on when to sell. Now let me turn to the next and more recent example of this type of purchasing opportunity which I cited in the original edition. I said, a somewhat similar situation may be occurring in the second half of 1957 in the case of the Food Machinery and Chemical Corporation. A few large institutional buyers have liked these shares for some time. Many more, however, seem to feel that in spite of some elements of interest they want evidence concerning certain matters before acquiring shares. To understand this attitude it is necessary to go into some of the background. Prior to World War II this company had confined its activities to a diversified line of machinery manufacture. As a result of brilliant management and equally brilliant developmental engineering, Food Machinery had become one of the spectacularly successful investments of the pre-war period. Then during the war, in addition to going into the related line of ordnance manufacture at which the company has been comparably successful, the company built up a diversified chemical business. Reason for this was a desire to stabilize the cyclical tendency of the machinery business through the manufacture of consumable products, sales of which over the years could be continuously expanded through research in much the same manner as had been so successfully exploited in the machinery and ordnance divisions. By 1952, 4 separate companies had been acquired and were converted into 4, now 5, divisions. Combined they represent slightly less than half the total sales volume if ordnance activities are included. Slightly more than half if only the normal non-defense activities are considered. Before and in the early acquisition years, these chemical units varied enormously. One was a leader in a rapidly growing field with broad profit margins and excellent technical prestige in the industry. Another suffered from obsolete plant, low margins, and poor morale. The average of all left much to be desired in comparison with the real leaders among chemical companies. In some cases there were intermediate products without basic raw materials. In others, there were plenty of low-profit raw materials, but few products with higher profit margins that could be built from these raw materials. The financial community reached some pretty definite conclusions on all this. The machinery divisions, with an internal growth rate of 9 to 10% per annum, comparable to the chemical industry as a whole, with a demonstrated ability to design and sell ingenious and commercially worthwhile new products year after year, and with some of the lowest cost plants in their respective fields, represented the highest grade investment. However, until the chemical divisions could demonstrate broader overall profit margins and other evidence of intrinsic quality, there was little desire to invest in this combined enterprise. Meanwhile, the management went aggressively to work to solve this problem. What did they do? Their first move was through internal promotions and external recruitments to build up a top management team. This new team spent money on modernizing old plant, developing new plant, and on research. Entirely aside from plant expenditures that are normally capitalized, it is impossible to undergo major modernization and plant expansion without running up current expenses as well. It is rather surprising that all the abnormal expenses that occurred in 1955, 1956, and 1957 did not cause reported chemical earnings to decline during that period. The fact that earnings held steady gives strong indication of the worth of what had already been done. In any event, if projects have been properly planned, the cumulative effect of those already completed must in time outweigh the abnormal expense of those still to come. Something of this sort might have happened as far back as 1956 if research expenditures in that year had not been increased about 50% above the 1955 levels. This was done even though in 1955 these expenditures for chemical research were not far below the average of the industry, and those for machinery research were well above that of most segments of the machinery business. In spite of continuing this higher level of research, such an earnings spurt was expected in the second half of 1957. At mid-year, the company's modernized chlorine cells at South Charleston, West Virginia, were scheduled to go on stream. Unexpected troubles, characteristic of the chemical industry but from which this company had been surprisingly free in most of its other modernization and expansion programs, indicate that it will be the first quarter of 1958 before this earnings spurt will now occur. I suspect that until this earning betterment comes and chemical profit margins grow and continue to broaden for a period of time, the institutional buyer will generally fail to look beneath the surface and will largely stay away from this stock. If, as I suspect will happen, such a development manifests itself in 1958 and 1959, financial sentiment sometime in that period will come around to recognizing the basic improvement in fundamentals that started several years before. At that time the stock, which may then continue to grow for years, will be selling at a price that has advanced partly because of the improvement in per-share earnings that had already occurred but even more because of the changed price-earnings ratio that results from a general reappraisal of the company's intrinsic quality. I believe the record of the past 2 years emphatically validates these comments. Possibly the first general recognition of what had been happening beneath the surface came when in the Depression-like year of 1958, a year when nearly all chemical and machinery companies showed a decided drop in earning power. Food machinery reported profits at an all-time peak of $2.39 per share. This was moderately above the levels of the several preceding years when the general economy was at higher levels. It was a tip-off that the chemical divisions were at last being brought to a point where they could take their place along with the machinery end of the business as a highly desirable and not a marginal investment. While 1959 profits are not yet available as these words are written, the sharp gains in earning power reported for the first 9 months over the corresponding period of 1958 give further assurance that the long period of reorganizing the chemical divisions is bearing rich fruit. The 1959 gains are perhaps particularly significant in that this is the year in which the Ordnance Division is in transition from its former principal product of an armored personnel and light equipment amphibious tank-like carrier made of steel, to an aluminum one that can be dropped from the air by parachute. This means that 1959 was the one year in the recent past or foreseeable future in which ordnance activities made no significant contribution to total earning power, yet an important new earning peak was attained. How was the market responding to all this? At the end of September 1957, when writing of the first edition was concluded, these shares were selling at 25 1/4. Today they are at 51, a gain of 102%. It is beginning to look as though the financial sentiment I mentioned in the original edition is beginning to recognize the basic improvement in fundamentals that started some years before. Other events are confirming this trend and may give further impetus to it. In 1959 the McGraw-Hill publications inaugurated a new custom. They decided each year to give an award for outstanding management achievement in the chemical industries. To determine the first winner of this honor, they selected an unusually distinguished and informed panel of 10 members. 4 represented leading university graduate schools of business administration, 3 came from major investment institutions with heavy holdings in the chemical industry, and 3 were leading members of prominent chemical consulting firms. 22 companies were nominated and 14 submitted presentations. This award for management accomplishment did not go to one or another of the giants of the industry, the managements of several of which, with very good reason, are highly respected in Wall Street. Instead, it went to the chemical divisions of the Food Machinery Corporation, which, 2 years before, had been regarded by most and is still regarded by many institutional stock buyers as a rather undesirable investment. Why is a matter of this sort of major importance to long-range investors? First, it gives strong assurance that, plus or minus the trend of general business activity, the earnings of such a company will grow for years to come. Informed chemical businessmen would not give this kind of award in the industry to a company that did not have the research departments to keep developing worthwhile new products and the chemical engineers to produce them profitably. Secondly, this type of award will leave its impression on the investment community. Nothing is more desirable for stockholders than the influence on share prices of an upward trend of earnings multiplied by a comparable upward trend in the way each dollar of such earnings is valued in the marketplace, as I mentioned in my concluding remarks about this company in the original edition. Other matters besides the introduction of new products and the problems of starting complex plants can also open up buying opportunities in the unusual company. For example, a Middle Western electronic company was, among other things, well known for its unusual and excellent labor relations. It grew to a point where size alone forced some change in its method of handling employees. An unfortunate interplay of personalities caused friction, slow-down strikes, and low productivity in an enterprise heretofore known for its good labor relations and high labor productivity. At just this time, the company made one of the very few mistakes it has made in judging the potential market for a new product. Earnings dropped precipitously, and so did the price of the shares. The unusually able and ingenious management made plans at once to correct this situation. While plans can be made in a matter of weeks, putting them into effect takes much longer. As results from these plans began coming through to earnings, the stock reached what might be called buying point A. However, it took about a year and a half before all the benefits could flow through to the profit statement. Toward the end of this period, a second strike occurred, settlement of which was the last step needed to enable the company to restore competitive efficiency. This strike was not a long one. Nevertheless, while this short and relatively inexpensive strike was occurring, word went through the financial community that labor matters were going from bad to worse. In spite of heavy buying from officers of the company, the stock went lower. It did not stay lower for long. This proved to be another of the right sort of buying opportunities from the standpoint of timing, and might be called buying point B. Those who looked beneath the surface and saw what was really happening were able to buy, at bargain prices, a stock that may well grow for them for many years. Let us see just how profitable it might have been if an investor had bought at either buying point A or buying point B. I do not intend to use the lowest price, which a table of monthly price ranges would show that this stock reached in either period. This is because only a few hundred shares changed hands at the extreme low point. If an investor had bought at the absolute lows, it would have been more a matter of luck than anything else. Instead, I will use a figure moderately above the low in one case and several points above in the other. In each instance a good many thousand shares were available and changed hands at these levels. I will use only prices at which the shares could easily have been bought by anyone making a realistic study of the situation. At buying point A, the stocks had slipped in just a few months by about 24% from its former peak. Within about a year, those who bought here would have had a gain in market value of between 55% and 60%. Then came the strike that produced buying point B. The stock dropped back almost 20%. Strangely enough, it remained there for some weeks after this strike ended. At this time, a brilliant employee of a large investment trust explained to me that he knew how good the situation was and what was almost sure to happen. Nevertheless, he would not recommend the purchase to his financial committee. He said certain of the members were sure to check with Wall Street friends and not only turn down his recommendation, but rebuke him for bringing to their attention a company with a sloppy management and hopeless labor relations. As I write this not so many months later, the stocks has already risen 50% from buying point B. This means that it is now up over 90% from buying point A. More important, the company's future looks brilliant, with every prospect that it will enjoy abnormal growth for years to come, just as it did for some years before the combination of unusual and temporary unfortunate occurrences produced buying points A and B. Those who bought at either time got into the right sort of company at the right sort of time. In short, the company into which the investor should be buying is the company which is doing things under the guidance of exceptionally able management. A few of these things are bound to fail. Others will from time to time produce unexpected troubles before they succeed. The investor should be thoroughly sure in his own mind that these troubles are temporary rather than permanent. Then if these troubles have produced a significant decline in the price of the affected stock and give promise of being solved in a matter of months rather than years, he will probably be on pretty safe ground in considering that this is a time when the stock may be bought. All buying points do not arise out of corporate troubles. In industries such as chemical production, where large amounts of capital are required for each dollar of sales, another type of opportunity sometimes occurs. The mathematics of such situations are usually about like this: a new plant or plants will be erected for, say, 10 million Australian dollars year or two after these plants are in full-scale operation. The company's engineers will go over them in detail. They will come up with proposals for spending an additional, say, $1.5 million. For this 15% greater total capital investment, the engineers will show how the output of the plants can be increased by perhaps 40% of previous capacity. Obviously, since the plants are already profitable and 40% more output can be made and sold for only 15% more capital cost, and since almost no additional general overhead is involved, the profit margin on this extra 40% of output will be unusually good. If the project is large enough to affect the company's earnings as a whole, buying the company's shares just before this improvement in earning power has been reflected in the market price for these shares can similarly mean a chance to get into the right sort of company at the right time. What is the common denominator of each of the examples just given? It is that a worthwhile improvement in earnings is coming in the right sort of company, but that this particular increase in earnings has not yet produced an upward move in the price of the company's shares. I believe that whenever this situation occurs, the right sort of investment may be considered to be in a buying range. Conversely, when it does not occur, an investor will still in the long run make money if he buys into outstanding companies. However, he had then better have a somewhat greater degree of patience, for it will take him longer to make this money, and percentage-wise it will be a considerably smaller profit on his original investment. Does this mean that if a person has some money to invest, he should completely ignore what the future trend of the business cycle may be and invest 100% of this fund the moment he has found the right stocks, as defined in Chapter 3, and located a good buying point, as indicated in this chapter? A depression might strike right after he has made his investment. Since a decline of 40 to 50% from its peak is not at all uncommon for even the best stock in a normal business depression, is not completely ignoring the business cycle rather a risky policy? I think this risk may be taken in stride by the investor who, for a considerable period of time, has already had the bulk of his stocks placed in well-chosen situations. If properly chosen, these should by now have already shown him some fairly substantial capital gains. But now, either because he believes one of his securities should be sold or because some new funds have come his way, such an investor has funds to purchase something new unless it is one of those rare years when speculative buying is running riot in the stock market and major economic storm signals are virtually screaming their warnings, as happened in 1928 and 1929. I believe this class of investors should ignore any guesses on the coming trend of general business or the stock market. Instead, he should invest the appropriate funds as soon as the suitable buying opportunity arises. In contrast to guessing which way general business or the stock market may go, he should be able to judge with only a small probability of error what the company into which he wants to buy is going to do in relation to business in general. Therefore, he starts off with two advantages. He is making his bet upon something which he knows to be the case, rather than upon something about which he is largely guessing. Furthermore, since by definition he is only buying into a situation which for one reason or another is about to have a worthwhile increase in its earning power in the near or medium-term future, he has a second element of support. Just as his stock would have risen more than the average stock when this new source of earning power became recognized in the marketplace if business had remained good, so if by bad fortune he has made his new purchase just prior to a general market break, the same new source of earnings should prevent these shares from declining quite as much as other stocks of the same general type. However, many investors are not in the happy position of having a backlog of well-chosen investments bought comfortably below present prices. Perhaps this may be the first time they have funds to invest. Perhaps they may have a portfolio of bonds or relatively static non-growth stocks which at long last they desire to convert into shares that in the future will show them more worthwhile gains. If such investors get possession of new funds or develop a desire to convert to growth stocks after a prolonged period of prosperity and many years of rising stock prices, should they too ignore the hazards of a possible business depression? Such an investor would not be in a very happy position if, later on, he realized he had committed all or most of his assets near the top of a long rise or just prior to a major decline. This does create a problem. However, the solution to this problem is not especially difficult, as in so many other things connected with the stock market. It just requires an extra bit of patience. I believe investors in this group should start buying the appropriate type of common stocks just as soon as they feel sure they have located one or more of them. However, having made a start in this type of purchasing, they should stagger the timing of further buying. They should plan to allow several years before the final part of their available funds will have become invested. By so doing, if the market has a severe decline somewhere in this period, they will still have purchasing power available to take advantage of such a decline. If no decline occurs and they have properly selected their earlier purchases, they should have at least a few substantial gains on such holdings. This would provide a cushion so that if a severe decline happened to occur at the worst possible time for them, which would be just after the final part of their funds had become fully invested, The gains on the earlier purchases should largely, if not entirely, offset the declines on the more recent ones. No severe loss of original capital would therefore be involved. There is an equally important reason why investors who have not already obtained a record of satisfactory investments, and who have enough funds to be able to stagger their purchases should do so. This is that such investors will have had a practical demonstration, prior to using up all their funds, that they or their advisors are sufficient masters of investment technique to operate with reasonable efficiency. In the event that such a record had not been attained, at least all of an investor's assets would not be committed before he had had a warning signal to revise his investment technique or to get someone else to handle such matters for him. All types of common stock investors might well keep one basic thought in mind. Otherwise, the financial community's constant worry about and preoccupation with the danger of downswings in the business cycle will paralyze much worthwhile investment action. This thought is that here in the mid-20th century the current phase of the business cycle is but one of at least 5 powerful forces. All of these forces, either by influencing mass psychology or by direct economic operation, can have an extremely powerful influence on the general level of stock prices. The other 4 influences are the trend of interest rates, the overall governmental attitude toward investment and private enterprise, the long-range trend to more and more inflation, and, possibly most powerful of all, new inventions and techniques as they affect old industries. These forces are seldom all pulling stock prices in the same direction at the same time. Nor is any one of them necessarily going to be of vastly greater importance than any other for long periods of time. So complex and diverse are these influences that the safest course to follow will be the one that at first glance appears to be the most risky. This is to take investment action when matters you know about a specific company appear to warrant such action. Be undeterred by fears or hopes based on conjectures, or conclusions based on surmises. When to sell, and when not to. There are many good reasons why an investor might decide to sell common stocks. He may want to build a new home or finance his son in a business. Any one of a number of similar reasons can, from the standpoint of happy living, make selling common stocks sensible. This type of selling, however, is personal rather than financial in its motive. As such, it is well beyond the scope of this book. These comments are only designed to cover that type of selling that is motivated by a single objective, obtaining the greatest total dollar benefit from the investment dollars available. I believe there are 3 reasons, and 3 reasons only, for the sale of any common stock which has been originally selected according to the investment principles already discussed. The first of these reasons should be obvious to anyone. This is when a mistake has been made in the original purchase and it becomes increasingly clear that the factual background of the particular company is, by a significant margin, less favorable than originally believed. The proper handling of this type of situation is largely a matter of emotional self-control. To some degree it also depends upon the investor's ability to be honest with himself. 2 of the important characteristics of common stock investment are the large profits that can come with proper handling, and the high degree of skill, knowledge, and judgment required for such proper handling. Since the process of obtaining these almost fantastic profits is so complex, it is not surprising that a certain percentage of errors in purchasing are sure to occur. Fortunately, the long-range profits from really good common stocks should more than balance the losses from a normal percentage of such mistakes. They should leave a tremendous margin of gain as well. This is particularly true if the mistake is recognized quickly. When this happens, losses, if any, should be far smaller than if the stock bought in error had been held for a long period of time. Even more important, the funds tied up in the undesirable situation are free to be used for something else which, if properly selected, should produce substantial gains. However, there is a complicating factor that makes the handling of investment mistakes more difficult. This is the ego in each of us. None of us likes to admit to himself that he has been wrong. If we have made a mistake in buying a stock but can't sell the stock at a small profit, we have somehow lost any sense of having been foolish. On the other hand, if we sell at a small loss, we are quite unhappy about the whole matter. This reaction, while completely natural and normal, is probably one of the most dangerous in which we can indulge ourselves in the entire investment process. More money has probably been lost by investors holding a stock they really did not want until they could at least come out even and from any other single reason. If to these actual losses are added the profits that might have been made through the proper reinvestment of these funds, if such reinvestment had been made when the mistake was first realized, the cost of self-indulgence becomes truly tremendous. Furthermore, this dislike of taking a loss, even a small loss, is just as illogical as it is natural. If the real object of common stock investment is the making of a gain of a great many hundreds% over a period of years, the difference between, say, a 20% loss or a 5% profit becomes a comparatively insignificant matter. What matters is not whether a loss occasionally occurs. What does matter is whether worthwhile profits so often fail to materialize. That the skill of the investor or his advisor in handling investments must be questioned. While losses should never cause strong self-disgust or emotional upset, neither should they be passed over lightly. They should always be reviewed with care so that a lesson is learned from each of them. If the particular elements which caused a misjudgment on a common stock purchase are thoroughly understood, it is unlikely that another poor purchase will be made through misjudging the same investment factors. We come now to the second reason why sales should be made of a common stock purchased under the investment principles already outlined in chapters 2 and 3. Sales should always be made of the stock of a company which, because of changes resulting from the passage of time, no longer qualifies in regard to the 15 points outlined in Chapter 3 to about the same degree it qualified at the time of purchase. This is why investors should be constantly on their guard. It explains why it is of such importance to keep at all times in close contact with the affairs of companies whose shares are held. When companies deteriorate in this way, they usually do so for one of two reasons. Either there has been a deterioration of management, or the company no longer has the prospect of increasing the markets for its product in the way it formerly did. Sometimes management deteriorates because success has affected one or more key executives. Smugness, complacency, or inertia replace the former drive and ingenuity. More often it occurs because a new set of top executives do not measure up to the standard of performance set by their predecessors. Either they no longer hold to the policies that have made the company outstandingly successful, or they do not have the ability to continue to carry out such policies. When any of these things happen, the affected stock should be sold at once, regardless of how good the general market may look or how big the capital gains tax may be. Similarly, it sometimes happens that after growing spectacularly for many years, a company will reach a stage where the growth prospects of its markets are exhausted. From this time on, it will only do about as well as industry as a whole. It will only progress at about the same rate as the national economy does. This change may not be due to any deterioration of the management. Many management show great skill in developing related or allied products to take advantage of growth in their immediate field. They recognize, however, that they do not have any particular advantage if they go into unrelated spheres of activity. Hence, if after years of being experts in a young and growing industry, times change and the company has pretty well exhausted the growth prospects of its market, its shares have deteriorated in an important way from the standards outlined under our frequently mentioned 15 points. Such a stock should then be sold. In this instance, selling might take place at a more leisurely pace than if management deterioration had set in. Possibly part of the holding might be kept until a more suitable investment could be found. However, in any event, the company should be recognized as no longer suitable for worthwhile investment. The amount of capital gains tax, no matter how large, should seldom prevent the switching of such funds into some other situation which, in the years ahead, may grow in a manner similar to the way in which this investment formerly grew. There is a good test as to whether companies no longer adequately qualify in regard to this matter of expected further growth. This is for the investor to ask himself whether at the next peak of a business cycle, regardless of what may happen in the meantime, the comparative per share earnings, after allowances for stock dividends and stock splits but not for new shares issued for additional capital, will probably show at least as great an increase from present levels as the present levels show from the last known peak of general business activity. If the answer is in the affirmative, the stock probably should be held. If in the negative, it should probably be sold. For those who follow the right principles in making their original purchases, the third reason why a stock might be sold seldom arises, and should be acted upon only if an investor is very sure of his ground. It arises from the fact that opportunities for attractive investment are extremely hard to find. From a timing standpoint, they are seldom found just when investment funds happen to be available. If an investor has had funds for investment for quite a period of time and found few attractive situations into which to place these funds, he may well place some or all of them in a well-run company which he believes has definite growth prospects. However, these growth prospects may be at a slower average annual rate than may appear to be the case for some other seemingly more attractive situation that is found later. The already owned company may in some other important aspects appear to be less attractive as well. If the evidence is clear-cut and the investor feels quite sure of his ground, it will, even after paying capital gains taxes, probably pay him handsomely to switch into the situation with seemingly better prospects. The company that can show an average annual increase of 12% for a long period of years should be a source of considerable financial satisfaction to its owners. However, the difference between these results and those that could occur from a company showing a 20% average annual gain would be well worth the additional trouble and capital gains taxes that might be involved. A word of caution may not be amiss, however, in regard to too readily selling a common stock in the hope of switching these funds into a still better one. There is always a risk that some major element in the picture has been misjudged. If this happens, the investment probably will not turn out nearly as well as anticipated. In contrast, an alert investor who has held a good stock for some time usually gets to know its less desirable as well as its more desirable characteristics. Therefore, before selling a rather satisfactory holding in order to get a still better one, there is need of the greatest care in trying to appraise accurately all elements of the situation. At this point the critical reader has probably discerned a basic investment principle which by and large seems only to be understood by a small minority of successful investors. This is that once a stock has been properly selected and has borne the test of time, it is only occasionally that there is any reason for selling it at all. However, Recommendations and comments continue to pour out of the financial community, giving other types of reasons for selling outstanding common stocks. What about the validity of such reasons? Most frequently given of such reasons is the conviction that a general stock market decline of some proportion is somewhere in the offing. In the preceding chapter, I tried to show that postponing an attractive purchase because of fear of what the general market might do will, over the years, prove very costly. This is because the investor is ignoring a powerful influence about which he has positive knowledge through fear of a less powerful force about which, in the present state of human knowledge, he and everyone else is largely guessing. If the argument is valid that the purchase of attractive common stocks should not be unduly influenced by fear of ordinary bear markets, the argument against selling outstanding stocks because of these fears is even more impressive. All the arguments mentioned in the previous chapter equally apply here. Furthermore, the chance of the investor being right in making such sales is still further diminished by the factor of the capital gains tax. Because of the very large profit such outstanding stocks should be showing if they have been held for a period of years, this capital gains tax can still further accentuate the cost of making such sales. There is another and even more costly reason why an investor should never sell out of an outstanding situation because of the possibility that an ordinary bear market may be about to occur. If the company is really a right one, the next bull market should see the stock making a new peak well above those so far attained. How is the investor to know when to buy back? Theoretically, it should be after the coming decline. However, this presupposes that the investor will know when the decline will end. I have seen many investors dispose of a holding that was to show stupendous gain in the years ahead because of this fear of a coming bear market. Frequently the bear market never came and the stock went right on up. When a bear market has come, I have not seen 1 time in 10 when the investor actually got back into the same shares before they had gone up above his selling price. Usually he either waited for them to go far lower than they actually dropped, or, when they were way down, fear of something else happening still prevented their reinstatement. This brings us to another line of reasoning so often used to cause well-intentioned but unsophisticated investors to miss huge future profits. This is the argument that an outstanding stock has become overpriced and therefore should be sold. What is more logical than this? If a stock is overpriced, why not sell it rather than keep it? Before reaching hasty conclusions, let us look a little bit below the surface. Just what is overpriced? What are we trying to accomplish? Any really good stock will sell and should sell at a higher ratio to current earnings than a stock with a stable rather than an expanding earning power. After all, this probability of participating in continued growth is obviously worth something. When we say that the stock is overpriced, we may mean that it is selling at an even higher ratio in relation to this expected earning power than we believe it should be. Possibly we may mean that it is selling at an even higher ratio than our other comparable stocks with similar prospects of materially increasing their future earnings. All of this is trying to measure something with a greater degree of preciseness than is possible. The investor cannot pinpoint just how much per share a particular company will earn 2 years from now. He can at best judge this within such general and non-mathematical limits as about the same, up moderately, up a lot, or up tremendously. As a matter of fact, the company's top management cannot come a great deal closer than this. Either they or the investor should come pretty close in judging whether a sizable increase in average earnings is likely to occur a few years from now. But just how much increase, or the exact year in which it will occur, usually involves guessing on enough variables to make precise predictions impossible. Under these circumstances, How can anyone say with even moderate precision just what is overpriced for an outstanding company with an unusually rapid growth rate? Suppose that instead of selling at 25 times earnings, as usually happens, the stock is now at 35 times earnings. Perhaps there are new products in the immediate future, the real economic importance of which the financial community has not yet grasped. Perhaps there are not any such products. If the growth rate is so good that in another 10 years the company might well have quadrupled, is it really of such great concern whether at the moment the stock might or might not be 35% overpriced? That which really matters is not to disturb a position that is going to be worth a great deal more later. Again, our old friend the capital gains tax adds its bit to these conclusions. Growth stocks which are recommended for sale because they are supposedly overpriced nearly always will cost their owners a sizable capital gains tax if they are sold. Therefore, in addition to the risk of losing a permanent position in a company which over the years should continue to show unusual further gains, we also incur a sizable tax liability. Isn't it safer and cheaper simply to make up our minds that momentarily the stock may be somewhat ahead of itself? We already have a sizable profit in it. If for a while the stock loses, say, 35% of its current market quotation, is this really such a serious matter? Again, isn't the maintaining of our position rather than the possibility of temporarily losing a small part of our capital gain the matter which is really important? There is still one other argument investors sometimes use to separate themselves from the profits they would otherwise make. This one is the most ridiculous of all. It is that the stock they own has had a huge advance. Therefore, just because it has gone up, it has probably used up most of its potential. Consequently, they should sell it and buy something that hasn't gone up yet. Outstanding companies, the only type which I believe the investors should buy, just don't function this way. How they do function might best be understood by considering the following somewhat fanciful analogy. Suppose it is the day you graduated from college. If you did not go to college, consider it to be the day of your high school graduation. From the standpoint of our example, it will make no difference whatsoever. Now suppose that on this day each of your male classmates had an urgent need of immediate cash. Each offered you the same deal. If you would give them a sum of money equivalent to 10 times whatever they might earn during the first 12 months after they had gone to work, that classmate would for the balance of his life turn over to you 1/4 of each year's earnings. Finally, let us suppose that, while you thought this was an excellent proposition, you only had spare cash on hand sufficient to make such a deal with 3 of your classmates. At this point, your reasoning would closely resemble that of the investor using sound investment principles in selecting common stocks. You would immediately start analyzing your classmates, not from the standpoint of how pleasant they might be or even how talented they might be in other ways, but solely to determine how much money they might make. If you were part of a large class, you would probably eliminate quite a number solely on the ground of not knowing them sufficiently well to be able to pass worthwhile judgment on just how financially proficient they actually would get to be. Here again, the analogy with intelligent common stock buying runs very close. Eventually you would pick the 3 classmates you felt would have the greatest future earning power. You would make your deal with them. 10 years have passed. One of your 3 has done sensationally. Going to work for a large corporation, he has won promotion after promotion. Already insiders in the company are saying that the president has his eye on him and that in another 10 years he will probably take the top job. He will be in line for the large compensation, stock options, and pension benefits that go with that job. Under these circumstances, What would even the writers of stock market reports who urge taking profits on superb stocks that have gotten ahead of the market think if you're selling out your contract with this former classmate, just because someone has offered you 600% on your original investment? You would think that anyone would need to have his head examined if he were to advise you to sell this contract and replace it with one with another former classmate whose annual earnings still were about the same as when he left school 10 years before. The argument that your successful classmate had had his advance while the advance of your, financially, unsuccessful classmate still lay ahead of him would probably sound rather silly. If you know your common stocks equally well, many of the arguments commonly heard for selling the good ones sound equally silly. You may be thinking all this sounds fine, but actually classmates are not common stocks. To be sure, there is one major difference. That difference increases rather than decreases the reason for never selling the outstanding common stock just because it has had a huge rise and may be temporarily overpriced. This difference is that the classmate is finite, may die soon and is sure to die eventually. There is no similar lifespan for the common stock. The company behind the common stock can have a practice of selecting management talent in depth and training such talent in company policies, methods, and techniques in a way which will retain and pass on the corporate vigor for generations. Look at DuPont in its second century of corporate existence. Look at Dow years after the death of its brilliant founder. In this era of unlimited human wants and incredible markets, there is no limitation to corporate growth such as the lifespan places upon the individual. Perhaps the thoughts behind this chapter might be put into a single sentence: if the job has been correctly done when a common stock is purchased, the time to sell it is almost never. The hullabaloo about dividends. There is a considerable degree of twisted thinking and general acceptance of half-truths about a number of aspects of common stock investments. However, whenever the significance and importance of dividends are considered, the confusion of the typical investor becomes little short of monumental. This confusion and acceptance of half-truths spreads over even to the choice of words customarily used in describing various types of dividend action. A corporation has been paying no dividend or a small one. Its president requests the board of directors to start paying a substantial dividend. This is done. In speaking of this action, he or the board will often describe it by saying that the time had come to do something for stockholders. The inference is that by not paying or raising the dividend, the company had been doing nothing for its stockholders. This could possibly be true. However, it certainly was not true just because no dividend action had been taken. It is possible that by spending earnings not as dividends but to build a new plant, to launch a new product line, or to install some major cost-saving equipment in an old plant, the management might have been doing much more to benefit the stockholder than it would have been doing just by passing these earnings out as dividends. No matter what might be done with any earnings not passed on as dividends, increases in the dividend rate are invariably referred to as favorable dividend action. Possibly with greater reason, reduction or elimination of dividends is nearly always called unfavorable. One of the main reasons for the confusion about dividends in the public mind is the great variation between the amount of benefit, if any, that accrues to the stockholder each time earnings are not passed on to him but retained in the business. At times he is not benefited at all by such retained earnings. At others he is benefited only in a negative sense. If the earnings were not retained, his holdings would decrease in value. However, the retained earnings in no sense increase the value of his holdings, therefore, they seem of no benefit to him. Finally, In the many cases where the stockholder benefits enormously from retained earnings, the benefits accrue in quite different proportions to different types of stockholders within the same company, thereby confusing investor thinking even more. In other words, each time earnings are not passed out as dividends, such action must be examined on its own merit to see exactly what is actually happening. It might pay to look a little below the surface here and discuss some of these differences in detail. When do stockholders get no benefit from retained earnings? One way is when managements pile up cash and liquid assets far beyond any present or prospective needs of the business. The management might have no nefarious motive in doing this. Some executives get a sense of confidence and security from steadily piling up unneeded liquid reserves. They don't seem to realize they are buttressing their own feelings of security by not turning over to the stockholder wealth which he should be entitled to use in his own way and as he sees fit. Today there are tax laws which tend to curb this evil so that while it still occurs, it is no longer the factor which it once was. There is another and more serious way in which earnings are frequently retained in the business without any significant benefit to stockholders. This occurs when substandard managements can get only a subnormal return on the capital already in the business, yet use the retained earnings merely to enlarge the inefficient operation rather than to make it better. What normally happens is that the management, having in time built up a larger inefficient domain over which to rule, usually succeeds in justifying bigger salaries for itself on the grounds that it is doing a bigger job. The stockholders end up with little or no profit. Neither of these situations is likely to affect the investor who follows the concept discussed in this book. He is buying stocks because they are outstanding and not just because they are cheap. Managements with inefficient and substandard operations would fail to qualify under our 15 points. Meanwhile, managements of the type that do qualify would almost certainly be finding uses for surplus cash and not just piling it up. How can it happen that earnings retained in the business can be vitally needed yet have no possibility of increasing the value of the stockholder shares? This can occur in one of two ways. One way is when a change in custom or public demand forces each competitive company to spend money on so-called assets which in no sense increase the volume of business, but which would cause a loss of business if the expenditure had not been made. A retail store installing an expensive air conditioning system is a classic example of this sort of thing. After each competitive store has installed such equipment, no net increase in business will occur, yet any store which had not met the competitive move might find very few customers on a hot summer day. Since for some strange reason our accepted accounting system and the tax laws which are based on it make no differentiation between assets of this type and those which have actually increased the value of the business, the stockholder frequently thinks that he has been badly treated when earnings have not been passed out to him, and yet he can see no increase in value coming to him from what was retained in the business. The other and even more important way that retained earnings fail to produce increased profits results from an even more serious failure of our accepted accounting methods. In our world of rapid and major changes in the purchasing value of our money units, standard accounting proceeds as though the dollar were a fixed unit of value. Accountants say this is all accounting is supposed to do. This may very well be true. But if a balance sheet is supposed to have any relationship to the real values of the assets described thereon, the confusion that results seems about parallel to what would happen if engineers and scientists made their calculations in our three-dimensional world by using only two-dimensional plane geometry. The depreciation allowance in theory should be enough to replace an existing asset when that asset is no longer economically usable. If the depreciation rate were properly calculated and the replacement cost of the asset remained unchanged over its useful life, this would happen. But with ever-rising costs, the total accumulated depreciation is seldom enough to replace the outmoded asset. Therefore, additional sums must be retained from the earnings merely to make up the difference if the corporation is to continue to have what it had before. This type of thing, while affecting all investors, usually affects holders of growth companies less than any other class. This is because the rate of acquiring new capital assets, as against merely replacing existing and about to be retired assets, is usually so fast that more of the depreciation is on recently acquired assets installed at somewhere near today's values. A smaller percentage of it is for assets installed years ago at a fraction of today's costs. It would be repetitious to go into detail concerning the cases where retaining earnings for building new plants and launching new products has proven of spectacular advantage to investors. However, consideration of how much one type of investor benefits in relation to another is worthy of careful consideration for two reasons. It is a matter about which there is always misunderstanding throughout the financial community. It is also a matter the proper understanding of which provides an easy key to evaluating the real significance of dividends. Let us examine these misconceptions about who benefits most from dividends by taking a fictitious example. The well-managed XYZ Corporation has had a steady growth in its earnings over the last several years. The dividend rate has remained the same. Consequently, whereas 4 years ago it took 50% of earnings to pay the dividend, so much additional earning power has developed in these 4 years that paying the same dividend now requires only 25% of this year's earnings. Some directors want to raise the dividend. Others point out that never before has the corporation had so many attractive places to invest the retained earnings. They further point out that only by maintaining rather than raising the rate will it be possible to exploit all the attractive opportunities available. Only in this way can the maximum growth be attained. At this point a lively discussion breaks out as to what course to follow. Someone on this fictitious board of directors is then sure to state one of the financial community's most common half-truths about dividends. This is that if the XYZ Corporation does not raise its dividend, it will be favoring its large stockholders at the expense of its small ones. The theory behind this is that the big stockholder is presumably in the higher bracket. After paying taxes, the big stockholder can retain a much smaller percentage of his dividends than the small stockholder. Therefore he does not want the increased dividend, whereas the small stockholder does want it. Actually, whether it is more to the interest of any individual XYZ Corporation stockholder to have the dividend raised or to have more funds plowed back into the growth depends upon something quite different from the size of his income. It depends upon whether or not each stockholder is at the point where he is putting any part of his income aside for additional investment. Millions of stockholders in the lower income brackets are handling their affairs so that each year they put something, no matter how little, aside for additional investment. If they are doing this and if, as is likely to be the case, they are paying income tax, it is a matter of elementary arithmetic that the board of directors would be acting against their interests by raising the dividend at a time when all these worthwhile opportunities are available for using retained company earnings. In contrast, the raised dividend might be to the interest of a big stockholder who had urgent need of additional funds, a contingency not entirely unknown to those in high tax brackets. Let us see just why all this is so. Almost anyone having enough surplus funds to own common stocks will probably also have enough income to be in at least the lowest tax bracket. Therefore, once he has used up his individual dividend exemption of $50, Even the smallest stockholder will presumably have to pay as tax at least 20% of any additional income he receives as dividends. In addition, he must pay a brokerage commission on any stock he buys. Because of odd lot charges, minimum commissions, etc., these costs run to a much larger percentage of the sums involved in small purchases than in large ones. This will bring the actual capital available for reinvestment well below 80% of the amount received. If the shareholder is in a higher tax bracket, the percentage of a dividend increase which he can actually use for reinvestment becomes proportionally less. There are, of course, certain special types of stockholders such as universities and pension funds that pay no income tax. There are also some individuals with dividend income less than the $50 individual exemption, although the total number of shares owned by this group appears to be small. For these special groups the equation is somewhat different. However, for the great majority of all stockholders, regardless of size, there is no avoiding this one basic fact about dividends. If they are saving any part of their income rather than spending it, and if they have their funds invested in the right sort of common stocks, they are better off when the managements of such companies reinvest increased earnings than they would be if these increased earnings were passed on to them as larger dividends which they would have to reinvest themselves. Nor is this advantage, having 100% of such funds put to work for them in place of the smaller amount that would be available. After income taxes and brokerage charges, the only one the stockholders get. Selecting the right common stock is not an easy or simple matter. If the company considering the dividends is a good one, the investor has already wisely done his task of selection. Therefore, he is usually running less risk in having this good management make the additional investment of these retained extra earnings than he would be running if he had to again risk serious error in finding some new and equally attractive investment for himself. The more outstanding the company considering whether to retain or pass on increased earnings, the more important this factor can become. This is why even the stockholder who does not pay income tax and who is not spending every bit of his income finds it almost as much to his interest as to the interest of his tax-paying counterpart to have such companies retain funds to take advantage of worthwhile new opportunities. Measured against this background, dividends begin to fall into true perspective. For those desiring the greatest benefit from the use of their funds, dividends begin rapidly to lose the importance that many in the financial community give them. This is as true for the conservative investor going into the institutional-type growth stock as for those willing and able to take greater risks for greater gain. The opinion is sometimes expressed that a high dividend return is a factor of safety. The theory behind this is that since the high-yield stock is already offering an above-average return, it cannot be overpriced and is not likely to go down very much. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Every study I have seen on this subject indicates that far more of those stocks giving a bad performance price-wise have come from the high dividend-paying rather than the low dividend-paying group. An otherwise good management which increases dividends, and thereby sacrifices worthwhile opportunities for reinvesting increased earnings in the business, is like the manager of a farm who rushes his magnificent livestock to market the minute he can sell them rather than raising them to the point where he can get the maximum price above his costs. He has produced a little more cash right now but at a frightful cost. I have commented about a corporation raising its dividend rather than about it paying any dividend at all. I am aware that while the occasional investor might not need any income, nearly all do. It is only in rare cases, even among outstanding corporations, that the opportunity for growth is so great that the management cannot afford to pay some part of earnings and still, through retaining the rest in through senior financing, obtain adequate cash to take advantage of worthwhile growth opportunities. Each investor must decide in relation to his own needs how much, if any, money to put into corporations with such abnormal growth factors that no dividends whatsoever are justified. What is most important, however, is that stocks are not bought in companies where the dividend payout is so emphasized that it restricts realizable growth. This brings us to what is probably the most important but least discussed aspect of dividends. This is regularity or dependability. The wise investor will plan his affairs. He will look ahead to what he can or cannot do with his income. He may not care about immediately increasing income, but he will want assurance against the decreased income and unexpected disruption of his plans that this can cause. Furthermore, he will want to make his own decisions between companies which should plow back a great part or all of their earnings and those that may grow at a good but slower rate and need to plow back a smaller proportion. For these reasons, those who set wise policies on stockholder relations and those who enjoy the high price-earnings ratios for their shares, which such policies help bring about, usually avoid the muddled thinking that typifies so many corporate treasurers and financial vice presidents. They set a dividend policy and will not change it. They will let stockholders know what this policy is. They may substantially change the dividend but seldom the policy. This policy will be based on the percentage of earnings that should be retained in the business for maximum growth. For younger and rapidly growing companies, it may be that no dividends at all will be paid for so many years. Then when assets have been brought to the point where the depreciation flow back is greater, from 25 to 40% of profits will be paid out to stockholders. For older companies, this payout ratio will vary from company to company. However, in no case will the rough percentages govern the exact amount paid out. This would make each year's dividend different from that of the year before. This is just what stockholders do not want, since it makes impossible independent long-range planning on their part. What they desire is a set amount approximating these percentages and paid out regularly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually, as the case may be. As earnings grow, the amount will occasionally be increased to bring the payout up to the former percentage. This, however, will only be done when funds are otherwise available for taking advantage of all the good opportunities for growth that the management is uncovering, and b.